We have a special episode for you today. We have Dr. Yannis Papastamatiou, who's on the program today to talk about his career in predatory science, shark science, but really focusing on predator dynamics. He went from growing up in the UK to now living in Florida to study predatory science. We're going to talk about how he went from there to Athens, to Long Beach, California, to Hawaii, and now he's in Florida. It's a great story. I can't wait for you to hear it. Let's start the show. Hey, everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host or co-host, Andrew Lewin, here with my co-host, Dr. David Ebert. Dave, this is a fun episode. We're really getting into the weeds of technical diving and scientific diving here, something we haven't done, I don't think, ever on this podcast. A really important one, because this is something that everybody asks all the time. Do you need a scuba diving certification to do this type of work? The type of work that Yannis does, you do, don't you?
Yep. Yeah. Most people come in there, they say, well, I'm a certified scuba diver, and that's good. But most shark research don't really need to be a certified. I mean, it helps, but it doesn't really need to be certified. Stuff Yanni does is very different. It's extreme technical diving, and we really get into it in this episode here. And I think a lot of the young people will be interested to know just what's involved in it. It's not something you do over a weekend or even a week. As you'll find out, it's quite a lengthy procedure to get into it. And but he's had some amazing stories and experiences going all over the world doing these mesophotic zones, looking at hammerhead sharks and Galapagos sharks and all other types of sharks, and seeing them in their environment like that few people ever will. So I really hope people enjoy it, and they enjoy the conversation today with Yanni in terms of his experiences as far as doing technical diving.
Absolutely. And with that said, here is the interview with Yannis Papastamatiou. Enjoy, and we'll talk to you after. Hey, Yannis, welcome to the Beyond Jaws podcast. Are you ready to talk all things sharks?
I'm looking forward to it. Thanks for having me.
Right.
Well, welcome to another episode of the Beyond Jaws podcast. We have an outstanding researcher today. We have Dr. Yannis Papastamatiou. I always got to work on the name there. He's an associate professor at Florida International University. Yannis was born and raised in London in the United Kingdom, but he spent his teenage years in Athens, Greece. He moved back to the United Kingdom to do his undergraduate in oceanography at the University of Southampton before moving to the U.S. to do a master's degree with Chris Lowe, who's been on a couple of the episodes of the Beyond Jaws podcast. He then went on to the University of Hawaii to do his PhD. And then after doing a couple of postdoctorates at the University of Florida and the University of Hawaii and a research fellowship at the University of St. Andrews, he took a position at the Florida International University, where he's currently an associate professor, and he runs the Predator Ecology and Conservation Lab. His studies on the physiology and behavioral ecology of marine predators and uses the information for conservation efforts. He's an extremely skilled diver who uses technical tools to study the ecology of mesophotic reefs, using those areas deeper than 50 meters. He's extremely well published with over 120 peer-reviewed publications, 6 book chapters. He's a frequent peer reviewer for various journals, and he's mentored numerous graduate students, including Allison Towner, who's also been on the podcast. And he's frequently on documentary programs such as Discovery Channel and Nat Geo. And on top of all that, he's also a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And so with that, Yannis, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So kind of the question we always start off with, how'd you get interested in sharks and marine biology?
Well, I was born in London, obviously fairly landlocked, but my father was Greek. So we used to go to Greece every summer. This is where I still lived in the UK and swim and snorkel a lot. And that's really where it kind of started for me. And then there was a couple of things that sort of added to my interest that really got me into sharks and wanting to do marine biology. And one was actually seeing Jaws. So Jaws had a big positive effect on me in the sense that I was kind of intrigued. And I found this character, Hooper, who is the marine biologist. It's kind of this nerdy guy, but who was basically one of the heroes of the film. And I kind of loved that. So that played an important role as well. And the other one was actually the Nat Geo documentary on sharks, which was from like the early 80s. And obviously back then, there weren't many shark documentaries. In fact, there were very, very few. And so this one had come out. I had a VHS copy of it. And it was the one that Eugenie Clark was on. And I watched that until like the tape was just, run dry. And I actually got to, just to go off on a tangent, I got to meet Jeannie at AES in Manaus in 2003, where you were there too, Dave, first time I met you. And I got to tell her that story. And then she also had, her kids were half Greek, so we had that connection as well. So it was really nice that I was able to to let her know that, and that, that was a big inspiration on me. And so that's kind of where it grew, and my love for not just the ocean, but for sharks specifically.
Mm-hmm. And so when you started, by the time you were like in high school and stuff, you kind of knew you were going to go off, you were interested in pursuing sharks and just.
I was already laser focused on that. That was going to be my career, and everything was kind of set up for that.
So I got to ask you, because I had the same experience when I was in high school too. When you went to see your guidance counselor and you told him you were going to study sharks, what was the reaction you got?
You got the look like you were crazy. And now, I mean, that's just almost kind of normal, right? I think a lot of people, I mean, everyone wants to study sharks, but back then it really was not really the case. There was, I think Shark Week had started mid 90s. It started, so really it hadn't started in the 80s. Mm-hmm. And even then it was very, very, when it did start, it was very, very small. So just documentaries were not, there weren't many. And so that you didn't see sharks on TV every day. It's not like it is now, where you can pretty much always turn on the television and there's somebody's diving with sharks.
Right. If I could just give a quick too, you mentioned the Jeannie Clark National Geographic show. I think it came out in about 1983 or 84. Mm-hmm. And I was going to say, I remember seeing that one myself. I was just starting my master's degree at the time. And if any of you have a chance to go find it, if you want to see I thought it was one of the best Nat Geo programs on sharks. And obviously had a big influence. Yeah, it's fantastic.
It was fantastic. And she was really ahead of her time, because I remember very clearly they were interviewing her and asking, what should you do if you're in the water and a shark comes across, swims past you? And she was like, you don't need to do anything, just look at it and be, happy to see this beautiful animal, which again, you'd expect to hear that now. But in 1984, that was not not a common response to seeing a shark. So she really was ahead of her time, and that made an impression on me. I remember thinking, well, if this shark expert says that, then there's something to it.
Right. Well, I'll push back a little on that. I think for a lot of people, they're still petrified of sharks. I think there's people who know sharks and watch those documentaries, watch Shark Week, and listen to people like yourself and Dave, and who are experts in sharks, and be like, oh, okay, so maybe we don't have to worry about it too much. And we see more videos of people around sharks, so maybe that's it. But when I talk to people here in Ontario, they are like, some people are like, nope, I am not going in the ocean. Like, there are sharks in there, I am not going in. So I think we still have a lot of work to do to still change that perception. But definitely, Eugenie Clark was one of those who started that movement.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. I was just going to say on a side, and maybe Yannis, you had the same experience, that I know living here in the Monterey area, people that are around I've mentioned this before, people that live here, you just sort of take sharks as part of the environment. If you go surfing, you go down, you just don't think about it. But if people come over, like from the Bay Area or from inland to the coast, then they're like, and you mentioned there's sharks out there, they're terrified.
Mm-hmm. So absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's your experience too.
I mean, the same thing with like Hawaii. I mean, if you're talking to the people who grew up there surfing, I mean, they've always experienced sharks around them, regardless of anything else. And that's just kind of been, if you want to surf, you're going to encounter sharks. But if you haven't experienced that before and you come in, then it can be a very different story. But I think, again, obviously there is a lot of fear still of sharks. But if you think of you can see the videos now of people off the coast of Miami, and there's a shark in the water, and often sometimes a big one, a big hammerhead, big tiger, and people are just sitting there. Yeah. Same as with the juvenile white sharks off of California. You have people on paddle boarding or even swimming, and they're like, they're just the level of fear that you would have seen 20, 30 years ago is not the same. But obviously, again, there'll probably never be a time when nobody is scared of them.
100%. You got to give them that respect, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You can go too far in the other direction.
Of course.
Right. So you got out of so when you finished up, obviously went on to university, and you picked up University of Southampton. I don't know much about it. You share, is it a pretty good university for?
Yeah. So Southampton has one, or at least did, one of the largest oceanography centers in Europe at the time, and it's one of the top programs for studying oceanography. And it still is kind of amazing to me how often I run into other Southampton undergraduates. So my friend that I did my undergraduate with, he's a professor at University of Miami. Alistair Harborne, who's a coral reef ecologist, and the office next door to me was an undergrad at Southampton.
Oh, wow.
Charlie Hooveneers, who you may know from Australia, was an
undergrad on the show.
Undergrad from Southampton. So there's a lot of us that came from Southampton, and again, I wasn't studying sharks. I actually was working more on deep sea invertebrates, but it gave me my initial background in sort of marine sciences.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. Oceanography and studying predators as you do now is a lot different. What made you go to an oceanography program instead of more of a marine biology program?
Well, so it was oceanography with a minor in marine biology. And again, at the time in the UK, there was very little to no shark work going on. I think the only person who might have been doing shark work then was David Sims. And I think he was maybe still a PhD student, so it was really not much was going on at the time. This was in the sort of mid-90s.
Right.
So there really wasn't anywhere to go and study sharks per se. But, my dad was a scientist. He was an engineer, and he was actually something which, I get to later, which was really true. Is like, you don't need to specialize at this point. The thing, get a good background in science. You don't have to be specializing in ichthyology now. Just do an undergrad that has a solid education on the basics, and that'll be fine before you move on up.
Mm-hmm. I just got to divert a second. You mentioned David Sims. I don't know if you knew this or not, but David Sims, Nick Dulvey, and Jim Ellis were all in the same lab at the same time together.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, Nick mentioned that.
Was this at Plymouth?
Gosh, I can't remember. I don't know if it was Southampton or Plymouth. I'm not sure where.
I know. I think David did his PhD at Plymouth, but now he's a professor at Southampton. So
okay. I might have back. Nick mentioned that all because I know all three of those guys, and you probably know them as well. Those are like you talk about. That was pretty much, I think, the brain trust of shark research in the UK at the time.
Well, there'd been Ian Preedy, who was the first person to put a satellite tag on a basking shark up in Scotland. But I don't think he was necessarily a shark person. He just, had done some work, this very sort of pioneering work, putting satellite tag on a basking shark. But he did a little bit too.
Yeah. But definitely there was not much going on when you were coming through. The only other guy I really knew before that was John Stevens back in the 70s, and he went to Plymouth as well. Doing his
and he actually, I believe he was in the same he was in high school with Kim Holland, who was then my advisor for my PhD in Hawaii. So
small
the
world.
Brits, we all do come from the same region and then just spread across the world.
I think one thing in the shark world, for those of us that are in it, you understand this, but those are not. It's a kind of a small incestuous world where usually you kind of know everybody. You went to school with them, or somewhere you cross paths if you're in the same sort of age cohort. It's kind of cool in a way because you kind of grow up together academically or research wise. But it's really it's not like you go there's it's not like there's thousands of people at a conference. If you get a couple hundred, that's a pretty good size.
No,
opposite.
It really is that sort of 6 degree, what's it called? The 6 degrees separation or it takes very little before you will find somebody you're connected to academically as you go back in time.
But it's interesting how we see such there's such great centers in the UK for, the undergraduate programs, some even master's and PhD programs. And then you see a lot of the UK people to go abroad, just like yourself going to the US, and going into your master's, you went to the US. What was the decision? And is this common with a lot of the UK people coming out of undergrad or even a graduate degree to go abroad and learn in a different sort of institution?
I think it's less so now because there are a lot more labs doing that work. But again, to graduate degrees at the time, there was, at least to my knowledge, there was very little. This is now getting mid to late 90s. Yeah. And so then, the main place to go was really, the US, where there was a few labs. I mean, South Africa, Len Campagna was there, but there wasn't too much outside of Len doing work in South Africa in the 90s. At least not from a university standpoint. And even Australia, there was some, but it wasn't like now. There's obviously lots of labs doing shark work, but it was still very limited number of labs doing work. My uncle was a US citizen, so he was living in the States. So that was also perhaps a driver why I always thought I would like to make the move to the US.
Gotcha.
How'd you happen to pick up Chris's lab? Was that just because of one of the? I mean, at the time, I know he took over from Don Nelson, but as you said, there was not a lot of labs doing sharks at the time.
No, well, so what happened was I finished my undergrad, and then I just looked around for places to try and do the internships, which I started sending out emails, and George Burgess wrote back to me and said, University of Florida shark attack file, you can come do an internship with me. So my first time ever in the US was in Gainesville, Florida. And I went for a month and I worked with George, and then I was looking for grad schools. And this was when, to look for like labs, you had to go to the AES handbook and look up, and under by each person's name was a series of letters in what their interests were. So I went through seeing who had a B for behavior, and there was no way to know if it was a grad student or a faculty member or what. You just would go and see who was interested. And so I spent ages going through this handbook, seeing what labs could I apply to. And George said, well, there's this guy who's just starting a faculty position, and I think he's going to be a really big deal in the shark world. He's just finished his PhD, and I would recommend applying to him. And that was Chris Lowe. Nice. So I wrote to Chris, and he just started. I don't think I would have gotten in today with like the level of competitiveness now graduate students, but at the time there weren't any. So I was like, I managed to get in. And it took me about a year because I had to go back and take my GRE exams and all that stuff. So I think it was like a year later, I went, made my move to Long Beach, California, and joined Chris's lab.
Okay. Oh, cool. Yeah, that's really cool. So you went obviously. And what'd you do? What'd you work on when you were at Chris's lab there? Did you do movement studies at the time?
No, I didn't. I actually ended up doing digestion in leopard sharks. And what had happened was, I really was into telemetry. And, Chris had, when I first got there, he was like, I want you to go and read all the papers on tracking, which in 2000, this is when I moved there, I was able to do in one semester. Imagine if you told somebody to do that now.
Oh my gosh.
That's like never going to happen. But in 2000, you could do that in a semester. Mm-hmm. And while I was doing it, I read a lot of Don Nelson's papers. Don was a big, big influence on me. And he was speaking about all these ideas he'd had for transmitters that measured things such as pH in the stomach to look at feeding, and video cameras, all the things that he didn't get around to doing. I don't think the technology was there for him to do it at the time, but the ideas were there. And so I started speaking to Chris about, making this sort of pH logger to look at foraging in sharks in the wild. And Chris was the one who said, you really need to learn the physiology of digestion if you want to do that. And at first I was like, I don't want to do physiology. That doesn't sound that interesting. But then as I started to look into it, it really started to intrigue me. And I realized that, physiology doesn't have to be dry. It doesn't just have to be about cellular biology. Obviously you need to understand that, but it can be a lot more, help you understand the ecology and the behavior of the animals. And so I started investigating sort of digestion in free swimming leopard sharks with these tags, which I bought from someone who was using them for penguins. And they would measure acidity in the stomach, and I could basically measure digestion in a shark that was swimming around, and then I would feed it. And what that also did was it introduced me to biologging, which is now a huge part of my career. Biologging wasn't a term then. There was telemetry, which was using transmitters, but this idea of putting loggers that would store this data, not transmit it, it didn't really have a term. And the only ones really doing it were people working with marine mammals or penguins. And so kind of just, by chance, I started to get into the use of data loggers to look in digestion in sharks. And that really was a big part of my early career.
Okay. So you went on, you did your master's there with Chris, and then I assume probably because Chris had been out at University of Hawaii, that kind of opened some doors for you to go to University of Hawaii you worked with Kim Holland, correct?
Yeah. So Chris was Kim's PhD student. And so we had gone and done a field trip, like a 3-week trip to Hawaii when I was at Long Beach, and I had met Kim. And so I wanted to do a PhD that involved sort of telemetry and biologging. And Kim had all these projects with not just sharks, but he did a lot of pelagic fish, a lot of tuna work. I wanted to get into billfish, big predators, basically. And so, I loved Hawaii, so that seemed like an obvious place for me. And I made the move over to University of Hawaii.
Okay. And how'd they go? What type would you work on?
Yeah. So then my PhD was on black tip reef sharks, and I continued the work I was doing with biologging, looking at digestion in this species. The thing that was great, I was at the Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology, and they had captive adult black-tip reef sharks. So I could do all these experiments with these captive sharks, on my doorstep. When I was at Long Beach, I had to actually do the experiments in the aquarium, the Long Beach Aquarium, because we didn't have the facilities for adult sharks. But at HIMB, they had these sharks. And then what I also did, I actually kept on working with Chris. He introduced me to some colleagues, and we started working at Palmyra Atoll. And Palmyra is this uninhabited atoll in the Central Pacific. It was a Navy base during World War II. And so the US Navy were kind of gearing up for this big fight. They thought the Japanese were going to be coming there to invade. And so they had like thousands of service men and women on this atoll. But the fight never happened. And so then they just got up and left. So Palmyra is like this sort of quintessential tropical atoll, uninhabited, that time is just starting to claim. So you have all these sort of World War II bunkers on the beach that are just sinking into the sand, in the lagoons. You can see army jeeps. There's still ammunition on some of the islands. And it's also been a U.S. federal wildlife refuge since 2001, I think, or 2003. Either way, because it's very remote, it has a fish and wildlife officers based there. The Nature Conservancy runs the island. So because it's remote and protected, it has a lot of sharks. It has very healthy shark populations. You can only get there with a permit. You certainly can't fish there. So you have huge populations of sharks, especially black-tip reef sharks. So then I started to do my sort of field work looking at the movements and ecology and foraging ecology of black-tip reef sharks at Palmyra, and then tying that in with what I was learning from digestive studies in captivity back on Oahu.
Mm-hmm. So when you're doing all that, and you were doing at this point, you were doing a lot of diving in your career. You're just really starting to get into the diving.
Yeah, so I'd started. I actually had been a diving instructor before I went to grad school. So I had become a diving instructor when I was in the UK, and then I got into scientific diving when I moved to California, and I was really involved with scientific diving. Then I actually would help teach a scientific diving class, and then when I moved over to Hawaii, we were doing a lot of diving, including coastal work, a lot of offshore diving. So we were doing work on FADs, which are these offshore, basically metal buoys with kilometers of chain. They're just offshore, and they aggregate pelagic fishes. So there's a lot of sort of tracking work looking at whether tunas and billfish are using these FADs. And we would dive on them a lot, which I absolutely love because, you could sometimes have huge schools of dolphin fish, huge schools of tuna, sometimes a billfish. And then my favorite was to see the occasional oceanic whitetip. So I was doing a lot of diving then, still sort of involved with training for scientific diving. And that was also in Hawaii when I started to get into technical diving.
Yeah. I was going to say, because you do a lot of really extreme technical type of diving, and which you go down obviously over 50 meters and stuff. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because it's a term people hear a lot about, but I don't know if it's like, how did you prepare for that? How did you, obviously you developed your skills as just diving and with your dive instructor and stuff, but how did you develop the skills to go to that next level?
Yes, I had no interest in doing that, to be honest. Like, I love diving, but I was like, technical diving, it looks like it's carrying a lot of stuff. And for audience who are not familiar with that term, it basically means if you are diving beyond recreational limits. So that could be diving below 50 meters, where you're going to have to breathe different gases. You're going to have decompression. It could be, going in an overhead environment, cave diving, wreck penetration. That would all be classified as technical diving, things that recreational divers can't do.
Right.
And the reason I got into it was actually there was a presentation in Hawaii when I first visited by a guy called Rich Pyle, who was an ichthyologist at the Bishop Museum. He was actually doing his PhD at the time. And he was the first person using rebreathers to look at fish communities at depths of about 100 to 120, 130 meters. And he was essentially, almost self-taught with these rebreathers, and he would dive by himself because no one else was doing that. He would literally dive by himself, and he would find all these new species of fish because he was the only person doing it.
Right.
And he gave this talk, and he had this video of I think it was silver-tip sharks at 400 feet on this beautiful reef, and I saw that, and I was like, okay, that looks cool. And the exploration side of things, it's very clear water, but there's a gloominess. It looks like the moon is the best way I can describe it. And I was like, okay, I know that feeling of you get to a certain depth and you're told you can't go any deeper than that. And you look down and you're like, I really want to go a little bit deeper and explore. So I was at the right place at the right time, because University of Hawaii's dive safety officer was trying to build a technical diving team to start, exploring mesophotic reefs, as they're called. So mesophotic just are basically coral reefs that are below 50 meters.
Yeah.
And so I started the training for open circuit mixed gases. So we actually have mixes with helium in there to deal with the sort of narcosis that you would get from breathing nitrogen at depth. And it was a long process. I think it took like 1.5 to 2 years before, we were kind of fully certified trimix divers with open circuit. And it was great. I mean, we used to go and do these training exploratory dives. We were checking out, unknown wrecks at 300 feet, taking scooters and then scootering back up the slopes. You would do these free ascents. You would drop down 300 feet into the blue, hit the bottom. There'd be this unknown wreck, and then you scooter up the reef and do your decompression. And it was fantastic. And then NOAA, because we were doing a lot of work in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, which are the uninhabited islands sort of north of Kauai. And they're basically atolls, and most of them have always been uninhabited. And it's also, it's a U.S. monument, so also very protected, very remote, lots of predators. So I was really working with Carl Meyer at University of Hawaii, and we were tracking, sharks and reef fishes along the Hawaiian Island chain. And each summer, NOAA would run these cruises, and we would go and we'd stop off at every single atoll of the chain, and we would, go and tag fish and put receivers down and dive. It was all shallow work. And then they started to get interested in exploring the mesophotic reefs. And so when they really put together, a sort of full-on technical diving team to go in, I think it was 2009, there weren't that many scientists certified. And so there was 6 of us, I think. There was like 3 or 4 NOAA divers, Richard Pyle, who was the whole reason I'd gotten into it. And then I was fortunate to also go myself and join that team. And so that's really where my great interest in mesophotic reefs came from. And then as I progressed, I switched over eventually to rebreathers, which are diving units where you recirculate your gas. And so that means it's kind of silent because there's no bubbles. And it's also very, very efficient because you're reusing oxygen that you're breathing out. So that means that, you would need many, many tanks to dive deep with open circuit. With a closed circuit rebreather, you can just take a few small tanks and those will last you hours. So then I eventually had to work my way back up with rebreathers to also then get to those depths using that tool.
How long did it take you for the certification for the mixed gas and then the rebreathers?
So the mixed gas, again, there's a series of stages. So you can, you start off with, advanced nitrox, and then you get some experience there, and then you go to technical nitrox, and then you get some experience there, and then you go on to trimix. So the way with technical diving, it's often sequential. There's a series of qualification courses, and in between you get a certain, you get experience in a certain number of hours before you move on up.
Gotcha.
With the rebreathers, it's even more specific. Like once to take the initial course for the rebreather course is probably a week, and then you'll be a certified rebreather diver diving to recreational dive limits. To move on to mixed gases, you need 50 to 100 hours on that unit before you can then take the course.
Gotcha.
Same with, when I moved to University of Florida, I was kind of landlocked. And so, again, never had any interest before, but I got into cave diving there. And same thing, it's a series of sequential courses, and then you get experience before you then move on to the next course until you end up with a fully fledged, full cave diver.
Gotcha.
So when you're doing this, like, for example, if you're diving, just take us on an example, like say you're diving to 100 meters, for example, like how long can you spend down there, and what's like the decompression time and all of that? Like what's the process of that?
Yeah, so the 100-meter dives, I was doing open circuit. So those tended to be pretty short, like 10, 15 minutes or so. And then we would have like an hour and a half of decompression. With rebreathers, we can do much longer. Generally with the rebreathers, I work between 60, 75, maybe 80 meters. I don't go, at this point, I haven't gone to 100 meters or below that. And then, we may spend like an hour at 60 meters, and you would have 2 to 3 hours of decompression. And again, as long as your rebreather doesn't fail, that's no problem at all. I mean, you can get by with the gas. But that's why. Well, the reason I said that is because that's why we do have to carry all these. You'll see when I do those dives, I still have open circuit bottles clipped to me. Right. So although I've only ever had to bail out once. For the most part, they're not getting used, but you have to have them there because unlike with open circuit, there's a couple of things with a rebreather that if they go wrong, you cannot use that unit and you have to go off it. So you have to have what we call bailout gas so that in an emergency, you can basically bail out. And that's why we do carry those tanks still.
Now, when you talk about decompression, do you come up like, I know like when I'm doing like diving, you come up, you hang out at like 3 meters, got it for so long or for an hour and a half, but can you work your way up work it out so you can like work at do something at that depth where you're.
Yeah. So now, there's various decompression models. The old ones used to be, they would just rocket you up to like 10 meters and then you'd have like 2 hours at 10 meters, but that rocketing it up is not good. So the models that we have now will have you start your stops generally much deeper than that. So the way you would do it is your initial stops will be deep but short, like 1 or 2 minutes. And you basically can think of it, you're going to start, let's say if I'm doing a dive to 200 feet, probably my first stops are starting at like 110, 100 feet. And then it's going to be approximately, you might initially have quite big jumps like 150 and then 100, and then it's going to be every 10 feet. And as you're getting progressively shallower, they're getting longer and longer and longer. So the longest stop would be at like 6 meters.
But now but on the way up, do you try to work it out so you're like at a certain depth on the reef, or are you just hanging out in the open ocean?
It completely depends. So the way we would do it in Hawaii was we would have to do, because you have to go out a long way to get to the mesophotic reef. So you would do a free descent, which also means you have to do a free ascent. So what we would do is, sometimes 200 feet, fire a float on a reel and you fire it up to the surface and then you just start ascending. So you're doing your decompression in mid-water. So you have to really have your buoyancy down because you're basically having to do these stops. The only reference you've got is your reel, and that's it. Mm-hmm. And so then the float's on the surface and the surface boat will just be following that surface float, and then hopefully they'll be there when you get up. The nicer way to do it, which is, for example, in French Polynesia now, the way we can do it is because you have these steep slopes. You can just drop down and then you can just do your decompression up the slope. So in Rangiroa, I have a project now, with great hammerheads. We'll go down to 200 feet and then I don't even need the boat to pick me up. I can end my decompression underneath the dock where the hotel is.
Oh, wow.
And just climb out. Yeah. So that's much nicer and it's safer because you're just coming up the reef. There's more stuff to see. Blue water decompression is, it can be pretty boring. And then also it's just more stressful because if something goes wrong, it's quite a bit harder to deal with.
Right.
Yeah.
And a lot of times you're diving in areas that are somewhat remote. So it's not like you can get to a chamber if something goes really bad.
Yeah, we try. So, like NOAA was probably the most remote places we were diving, and the boat there actually carried a chamber on board. And so for the most part, you try to have a chamber within 2 hours. Other times, if we're going really remote, like I've been a few times with California Academy of Sciences has a really great, mesophotic team, and they work much deeper than me. They're working down to 500 feet. So they're doing like 5 hour dives. But when they go to these remote spots, they actually bring a transportable chamber. You can actually have these chambers that they're only enough for one person that you basically unpack and then you fill up, but they will pressurize. So there is almost always a chamber within a couple of hours of the dive site.
Gotcha.
Now, when you're diving on these things, you're working on large predators, typically sharks and other species. What kind of data information can you collect when you're down there even if it's for 20 minutes or something? What kind of data?
There's been a variety. So one of the things we're doing is tagging. So actually tagging great hammerheads and getting tissue samples with like spear guns. And so you can get the samples from using spear guns or pole spears down on the bottom. Obviously, a lot of stuff involves like doing transects and counting fish and getting sort of community data. And the other thing is also, when we're doing like stable isotopes, where we're trying to figure out, we use stable isotopes to kind of look at the diet of predators and see where they're feeding. Are they feeding shallow? Are they feeding deep? And that means you've got to kind of sample some of the prey of these predators at the sites where you think they might be feeding. So in a mesophotic reef, we also may go and I've done, spearing trips where I basically go and collect reef fish at depth and then bring them up with me.
No, well, it obviously brings up a question. If you're looking at great hammerhead sharks and silver tips and these things, and you're spearing fish, I assume that sharks get a little frisky sometime about possible dinner.
I've never had a problem with them from spearing. And when we first started to do it in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands deep, I was really concerned about it because we had these, hour-long decompression in blue water where sometimes you'd have 200 Galapagos sharks around you. So I was like, oh, wow. God, if I've got for like an hour a bag of fish, that's going to be really bad. So I bought dry bags, and my plan was I take the dry bag with me, get my bag of fish at the bottom before I go up, and I'll stuff it in the dry bag and I'll seal off the dry bag. And that way there's no sort of effluent or any sort of blood going out. And then, at about 100 feet, 180 feet, I would hand the bag off to safety divers who would come down and meet us and they could take it back up. But I actually never needed it. The blood would bring them in and they would get curious, but they never came in aggressive. And I never had a problem with them responding to spearing in an aggressive manner. I'll tell you that what I've seen rile up sharks the most was when Carl Meyer and we were starting to do a project tagging grouper, the Hawaiian grouper, up in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, which in the main Hawaiian Islands, you generally see them pretty deep. But by the time you get up to Midway Atoll, Kure Atoll, which is far north, you're seeing them at 30 feet. And they're an important predator, so we started tagging them. And initially, we were trying to catch them to bring them to the surface to do the surgery on the boat. And, the barotrauma with all the sharks around, it just wasn't good for the fish. So we're like, we're going to do surgery underwater. We're going to catch these grouper underwater, do the surgery, and then we can put them straight under a hole. They can recover. There's no barotrauma. And that worked very, very well for the grouper. So the surgery went great. They would all recover. What we didn't realize was the first time we did it was just Carl and I. And a struggling grouper is the sort of the loudest dinner bell I've ever seen for sharks. I remember we were doing the surgery. I looked up and we were getting dive bombed by Galapagos sharks. I mean, they were just everywhere and they were a completely different state than what you were used to just from spearing. I mean, they were agitated and they were just, we were literally back to back, just going up, trying to push them off because they were such a state. And after that, I had to make sure we would bring I'd have 3 safety divers whose only job was to make sure we weren't going to get dive bombed while we were doing the surgery. That's insane. So that was a dinner bell, but the actual spearing fish was not so bad.
Oh, that's fascinating. That's fascinating. And you still got these projects going on, the ones you're talking about out there? And
so I haven't worked in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands in quite a while. So at the moment, the project I am working in Rangiroa. So we're doing this work with great hammerheads, which there's these channels and these hammerheads come in there. There's lots and lots of grey reef sharks, a lot of eagle rays. And the beautiful thing about great hammerheads is they're really shark killers. I mean, they like to hunt sharks and rays. And so they come there, to hunt in this channel. And I've not yet been able to see a great hammerhead hunting grey reef sharks, but several divers have. But although you can see them shallow, if you want to be able to do any tagging and interacting with them, it's generally on this ledge that's about 50, 60 meters deep.
Okay. No, that's neat. So I got to ask you. So you're seeing the eagle rays out there. Are you doing anything with the rays, or is it just strictly sharks you're looking at?
No. So we're starting to work with the rays now. So we're starting off this actually. I'm going back in March, and so hopefully we're going to be getting muscle biopsies from the rays to look at that. We've already collected muscle biopsies from the sharks to kind of see what proportion of the hammerhead's diet is these eagle rays based on stable isotopes. So the next stage is to get some muscle biopsies. Hopefully into the future, we can start doing some of the tagging of the rays as well to really look at sort of movements of predator and prey.
So when you have graduate students come in, say in your lab, they're and do many of them do the technical diving, or because it seems like it take them a couple of years just to get through that?
Yeah, no, they don't. I have a couple who have, by themselves are certified on rebreathers. The two reasons are, one is, as you said, it's not the sort of thing, especially if you want to do deep stuff, that you come in, to grad school and you're going to learn how to do. I think really, if that's what you want to do, you need to have that experience and training before you start,
Right.
which some do. You know, it's not. It's like, you know, having zero boat skills at all and then coming in and having to drive a boat offshore.
Right.
You know, you need to have a certain foundation to do projects like that.
Mm-hmm.
Also, you know, to be honest, and this is a little bit selfish of me, I don't really want the liability of a grad student doing that stuff, of my students on
sure.
me. And again, I'm not telling them not to. I just don't really personally want, you know, it's something that would bother me if it was for one of my projects and somebody got hurt. That would, you know, just be tough. So for those reasons, no.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's a dangerous skill. Yeah. Like even the process of it can be dangerous. You have to be very aware and like you said, have the experience to do it. And sometimes people come in, you know, early 20s and they just don't have they may be divers, but they don't have the time to get that experience, right? And just because of their age, right?
I mean, so if you follow the rules, I mean, it's you know, if you have a properly trained and have the proper equipment and follow the proper procedures, you know, the risk is you can actually keep it pretty minimal. And I'll give the example more of cave divers. I mean, if you look at cave diving fatalities that we have, I think 80% of those are untrained cave divers. They're open water divers who want to go into a cave and dive.
Right.
Very rarely do we get trained cave divers dying in caves because, again, for the most part, if you follow the rules and you know what you're doing with the right equipment, it's very safe. Of course, that's sometimes easier said than done. And, you know, things do happen and people do make mistakes. Experienced divers, good divers have made fatal mistakes before.
Right.
And that always happens. So the thing for me at least, is to just try to never get complacent about it, because that's really when mistakes do get made. And especially because you get used to nothing happening, right? You do a lot of them, for the most part, nothing ever happens. And then you start to think, well, nothing will happen. But obviously it takes one thing to go wrong once, and then that's a different story.
Another thing, I'm just kind of curious. I'm just kind of curious from I used to do a lot of just regular diving, but like, how do you work like with hypothermia when you're down for a long time? Even though you're in a lot of tropical areas, you're still at depth, and your even ambient water temperature in the tropics is still going to be lower than your body temperature. How do you deal with that?
So I've only done deep diving in tropical areas. So I've never done it in somewhere that's cold. And some of these places, like, you know, in the Marshall Islands, for example, it's so warm, even on deep dives, that it's almost too uncomfortable to wear a wetsuit. So wow. So again, there's different levels of technical diving. I mean, if you look at the technical divers in the UK or Europe who are doing 80-meter dives in the murk on wrecks in cold water, I don't want to do that. I mean, that's a whole different level of you know, skill. So technical diving is a continuum, obviously. I mean, there's easier ones to do, like the ones I do. There's easier ones in the tropics, and then there are places where it's frigid, and at that point, you know, you're going to have to obviously have dry suits. Some of my colleagues from France were doing, relatively deep dives under ice in the Antarctic, and so they had to have very special tailor-made dry suits to deal with the fact they had these long dives in very, very cold conditions. So cold that with at least one of my colleagues, the moisture, he was suddenly found a hard time breathing through his rebreathing. He couldn't figure out why. And it was because the moisture in his breath was freezing in the hoses. And so he was having to break up the ice so that he could finish his decompression. But luckily he was very, very experienced and figured it out. But I'm not doing that either.
No.
So how deep never want to dive? How deep?
I would love to dive Antarctic. I would love to dive the Antarctic. I'd love to dive the Arctic. But I think deep dives Antarctic, that's probably too much.
Seems really risky.
Yeah, that'd be. I know at least Moss Landing used to have a pretty active Antarctic program. They'd have people go down every year, and they used to go diving under the ice and everything. And
I would love to do that. That's one of my regrets. I'm not really sure I'd have the opportunity now, but not taking a chance to go and dive the Antarctic, because that would be something else. Yeah,
that'd be pretty. The only thing I always had troubles with at the time, because I'd love to have gone, but they're like, you're down there for like 3 months, so if you're gone,
that's why. It would be easier when you're in your 20s to go and do that, you know, and be able to take the 3 months to do that. Unless, of course, you know, Antarctic is your main research area, but obviously it's not mine. And that would
Right.
be the problem. I couldn't at this point imagine justifying a 3-month trip there,
That
although I would love to visit.
that's I was saying with me. I could have gone, but I just 3 months
Yeah.
of doing a benthic meiofauna study would have just I just like had to blow my brains out.
Leopard seals. That would be cool to study.
That would be
Yeah,
cool.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, actually,
Yeah.
I'd like to see the penguins. To be honest with you, in
Leopard
Antarctica.
seals eating penguins.
There you
Yeah,
go.
that works too. That'd be interesting. So, as long as they're doing that stuff. Well, how was it like when you were you talked about how Jaws was an influence on you and everything, and obviously you were in Chris Lowe's lab, and Chris is like they filmed Jaws out there when he was a kid, where he grew up there in Martha's Vineyard. I'm sure you didn't know that when you went out to work with Chris. How was that?
I didn't know that. And not only that, but Chris Lowe's uncle is in Jaws. He's one of the council members at the meeting when they're trying to hire Quint. So that was his uncle was actually in one of those scenes.
That's hilarious.
Oh, cool.
And the other connection is that Steven Spielberg did his undergrad at Long Beach, and actually he was a commencement speaker when I graduated. But the rumor is, and I'm not entirely sure if this is true, is that they filmed a scene because obviously then, Don Nelson was one of the very few shark labs in the US. I mean, there was Don Sonny, I think he was at at that point, but there weren't many for sure.
Yeah.
And I believe because of that Long Beach connection that they filmed a scene that was meant to be Hooper working in the lab that was in Don's lab at Long Beach that was ended up, cut from the final film. So I'm not 100% sure if that's true or not. I actually met Richard Dreyfuss once, and I meant to ask him, and then I forgot.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you may know this, but I don't know if you knew, but Leonard Capano actually helped design the mechanical shark Bruce in the movie.
Well, I did know that he's acknowledged at the end of the film. So when they're swimming, when Hooper and Brody are swimming back to shore, it does thank Len Capano in the credits.
He's the last one that came up.
Awesome.
Yeah. I would have. Did you know? I don't know if you knew Leonard very well, or did you
I met him a couple of times, but that was only at meetings, in passing.
He was I've heard people tell me that in the podcast where he was a character, and boy, to have been a fly on the wall to see Leonard and Spielberg running around on that mechanical shark. Oh my God, I would have. Oh, if I could go back in a time machine and watch that.
I went to an amazing play in New York called The Shark is Broken, which is about the filming of Jaws. It's the three main characters, and it's just basically they're filming the scene on what's the name of the boat at the very end? It's is it the Orca? No,
Orca. It's the Orca. Yeah, I think it is.
Is it the Orca?
Yeah, I think it's
I
the
can't
Orca.
remember. But the Quint's boat and the whole thing was about, the shark wouldn't work. And so they were having to redo a lot of these scenes. And the play was absolutely incredible. The guy playing Quint is actually Robert Shaw's son. So Robert Shaw played Quint in the movie. And so his son looks almost identical to Robert Shaw. And at the end, he does a whole, recitation of the Indianapolis speech.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like you're watching his dad on stage in front of you. I mean, it was, I don't go to too many plays, but that one really blew me away.
Oh, I can imagine. Man. So I got to ask you, since Jaws is an influence, we talked about the Nat Geo, did you ever see Blue Water, White Death?
I did. And, that was also an amazing documentary. And my two stories for that is I actually, first of all, I love that film or that show as sort of historical ecology, because there's the scene where they go diving with oceanic whitetips. And it's like the ocean's just filled with them, right? There's like maybe 100 oceanic whitetips in that scene, which is something you'd never see today. And just to kind of show you I think that was off of Durban, I believe it was.
Yeah, it was off Durban. Yeah.
And to show you what it used to look like back in the 70s. And then the other thing is actually when I was at HIMB, is it Stan Waterman? Was that his name?
Yep, Stan Waterman.
Yeah. Yep. He came by the lab. He was quite old at that point. And he came by, someone had brought him by and I just showed him a satellite tag and some biologgers. And I spent a little bit of time showing him all the different tags we used. And I told him that, that documentary was a big influence on me. And a month later, he sent me a signed copy.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. I think it was probably about 12 years old when that movie came out. And I remember going and seeing it. I just thought that was just like an amazing movie. And then, as you mentioned, if you watch the movie, and just for young people that haven't seen it, it's pretty graphic. It's not like the things you see today. The reason they went to Durban was because they used to get a lot of big white sharks come in, because that's where they used to have a whaling station there, and they'd pull the whales in that they'd harpoon, and the white sharks would come in there. And when I was a grad student in South Africa, you go look at some of those pictures. There were some massive white sharks, and that's why they went there. But as Yanni mentioned, they saw that at that time there was just oceanic white tips as far as you could see. They were literally like, they would get hundreds of them coming in. And it was nobody done anything like that before, where they actually went out to film white sharks or just film sharks in the wild. And you mentioned like Stan Waterman, the Rod and Valerie Taylor, and Peter Gimble.
Peter Grimble. I mean, it was a crazy time because like Peter Grimble was getting bent on TV. Like he was coming up with decompression sickness, refusing to go in the chamber. They were like forcing him. They were like, we're not filming anymore unless you go in the chamber and stop, because he just wouldn't stop. Yeah. And I think the funny thing is, right, they didn't find any white sharks in South Africa, even though if they'd gone further south to Huntsby, they would have probably found them. So they ended up Australia. I forget where they actually did the white shark.
It was dangerous. They finally ended up in Dangerous Reef, South Australia, but they went to like Sri Lanka.
They went all over the place.
But they finally found Dangerous Reef was where they found the white sharks and everything. And but as I mentioned at that time, Durban, because of the whaling station, they used to get a lot of big white sharks in there, and they had the fishing club there, and you can go there even today. They have what they call the 1,000-pound club, and guys would fish off the jetty there to land. If you landed a 1,000-pound white shark, and there's in the 50s and 60s, they landed quite a few of them there, and they're massive sharks. So there was I realized like if they gone down towards Cape Town, Hansby, they would have definitely run into them. But
those sites weren't known then.
No. Well, yeah. Well, I say they weren't. We say they weren't known, but if you talk to the locals down there, they knew about it.
Yeah.
I tell the story when I was a student there. The locals would tell me about, the white sharks out here breach. And I was like, what are you talking about? These breach? Because nobody had ever filmed that before. And then Chris Fallows, like about a couple years after I left, he started filming it. And but I'd seen it there, and like people thought if you told people, and I remember telling people like Greg Kaye, John McCosker, Bob Lee, that these sharks are breaching, and they thought like, no, you must be drunk or something. No way, no way the sharks are breaching. I said, yeah, they really are breaching down there. And
I went to South Africa in '99, so it was very shortly after Chris Fallows had started. He was just starting to make a name for himself with ththese pictures, and we were just for the first time kind of seeing these aerial white sharks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it was, anyways, just a bit I know it's a bit of a historical thing for younger people, but some of these programs you mentioned, like Blue Water White Death, of course, Jaws, probably most people have seen, but the Jeannie Clark Nat Geo from '84 when it came out, those are just, if you want to get a historical perspective of things, what was going on, those are just a couple of.
I made my graduate student Candice is basically doing conservation biology of oceanic white tips, specifically in the Bahamas. But I made her watch Blue Water White Death, so you can see what it used to look like in some places.
Yeah.
And what did she think?
I mean, again, and Cat Island, Bahamas, is a place where we work, and that's actually kind of unique in that you can go out there, and I've seen up to maybe 11 oceanic white tips on a dive. Oh, wow. And it's an ecotourism site. So it's a combination of, it's a natural aggregation area for these sharks, and they're there every year. But then there's also ecotourism on top of that has conditioned them. So you can go to sometime there and see like 11 oceanic whiteheads, which is extremely rare anywhere else.
Right.
But then you see Blue Water White Death, and that's a whole different. That was not a baited shark dive. That was like they just jumped in the ocean, and they were just there. This wall of oceanic whiteheads.
Wow. Right. Yeah, that was off Durban, where they had the white tips are usually offshore, but they have the netting off the beaches and stuff.
Yeah.
And at that time, if you went up toward like say Mozambique or Madagascar, it'd just been wild to see. And there are stuff, you read some of the stuff by John Bass and some of those guys, going off a little of a tangent, but there is some historical information to document how it used to be like for the oceanic white tips on stuff. And so you're actually doing a lot of stuff on oceanic white tips now yourself.
They're my favorite shark.
Yeah,
it's my favorite shark. And so, I started getting interested in them when I was in Hawaii, which we would see them sometimes. And in Kona, you would see them following pilot whales. And then really, I was able to join. Damien Chapman had this project where they were satellite tagging oceanic whitetips off of Cat Island, Bahamas, and I was really interested in what interested me about them was the fact that they live in this basically the oceanic equivalent of the desert, right? I mean, that's open ocean, very little food, it's very patchy. And they're a very unique shark to me in terms of how they look morphologically, these beautiful rounded fins, and then also how they behave. I really, when I'm in the water with oceanic whitetips, you just really feel that is a shark that is figuring you out, and you really should be on your toes, because it's just like it's very. I don't want to use the term smart, but you kind of, that's what I'm implying. Basically, it's a shark that is just like really on it. Yeah. And so I was really interested in what adaptations they have to live in this desert. So we wanted to put, these biologgers that included video cameras, accelerometers, swim speed sensors, and we could do biomechanics and try and see what these adaptations may be. And so, I joined their team and we started to put biologgers out on oceanic whitetips in the Bahamas. So I've worked there a lot. And then recently I was, involved with some colleagues who just started satellite tracking oceanic whitetips in French Polynesia as well.
So I got to share quickly a story with you, my oceanic whitetip story. When I was a grad student, we were doing some deep sets, long lines up on the Mozambique border with South Africa. It was in the late 80s. And at the time we did this one survey we did, there was myself, it was Paul Cowley, Jeremy Cliff, Sheldon Dudley, kind of the brain trust of the young shark guys, and Leonard Capano. Except for Leonard, who stayed in the boat, the rest of us, when you're kind of waiting for the long lines to soak, you jump off the back of the boat because you're in the tropics and it's hot as hell. And so we're snorkeling around there trying to maybe spearfish some mahi or whatever. And after an hour or so, we got out of the boat. And the whole time we're diving, this is up, blue waters, open ocean, saw nothing. We get out of the water, get in the boat, and within like 5 minutes, somebody goes, "Hey, check this out." And there's freaking oceanic whitetips under the boat, just swimming around. And I'm just going like, I probably saw half a dozen. There's, I don't know how many, probably at least a half a dozen under there. It wasn't like hundreds, but there was, a few of them swimming under the boat. One's enough, but it was like, I just remember thinking, we all kind of looked at each other and go like, these things didn't just show up all of a sudden. They had to have been around while we were diving, and none of us saw them. We were snorkeling. We were snorkeling around out there. It was probably 1,500 meters the depth where we were. And, it was, but yeah, I don't know if you had any.
I have, and in fact, similar, like being in water a few times with them, where you've seen them and they're very, very calm and swimming around, and it's been a really great experience. And they disappear, and you don't pay attention, and then the next thing you know, they're kind of rocketing up behind you. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying they would have come in for the bite, but they definitely were behaving differently when they had come up behind me, and I really did feel like this shark was kind of perhaps giving me a false sense of security, and then checking me out when I wasn't looking. Again, I'm not implying it was coming in to bite me, but it was behaving differently.
I mean, I wouldn't even say I wouldn't say they were like particularly aggressive, but they were just like, we just thought like there was like six of us in the water, nobody saw a shark at all, and then all of a sudden we get out in the back of the boat in the transom, and we just look over and like there's these oceanic whitetips swimming under the boat. It's like, where the hell these things come from?
So one of the, and I did get bit by one, and that was on the boat. It was one I was tagging. It wasn't in the water, but it was the first time that I had gotten bitten by a shark. And it was the one time the golden rule when you're tagging sharks is you never take your eyes off the head if you're holding the pectoral fins. And this shark had basically, we put a camera tag on her dorsal fin, and as we were releasing her, some line had gotten wrapped around the camera. And for just that 1 second, all I was concerned about was the $10,000 tag and the data. I was like, I don't want the camera to be offline. So I turned around to reach around and untie it. And then she had grabbed my hand.
Wow.
Yeah. So I got to ask you one question. Here's a couple more questions here. It's been a terrific interview, but so you're very involved in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Does that help you mentally, physically for any of the diving stuff you do, or is that just a completely separate activity?
No, I've always loved martial arts. I grew up in the 80s, Jean-Claude Van Damme, Bruce Lee, that was like Chuck Norris. I mean, so I've always been into martial arts, and I was always into like more, kicking. I was Taekwondo and then boxing. And I gradually switched as I moved to Hawaii and started to, pick up grappling. And so I had started Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu when I started my PhD in 2003. And it certainly is something like now, I mean, I really can't imagine being without it. I mean, I still, obviously how often I can train can be limited, but I try and still do 2-3 times a week. And both physically and also mentally. And it does help me under pressure, because the thing about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is, you grapple a lot. You actually spar with opponent, with people who are not, trying to let you win, who are going to try and beat you. And I like, I often go against people a lot heavier than me, and you get the fatigue, and then you're dealing with like very uncomfortable situations of having, let's say, someone much heavier than you, smothering you, you've got fatigue, and panic can start to set in. And especially I'm a bit claustrophobic, so it really does. So it helps me to have those situations and try and stay calm, because the fact is with a lot of these things, I'm talking about, technical diving, for example. I mean, panic is what'll get you.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying I wouldn't panic, because, it's one of those things that you just don't know until it happens. But at least I feel like it helps me stay grounded mentally. And then obviously, physically, it gives me, I'm very like, I can be inherently pretty lazy. So if I don't have exercise I enjoy doing, I'm just going to quickly lose interest in doing it. And so the fact that I have something that I just like to grapple means I'll go and do it, and I'll stay disciplined. I've stayed disciplined with it for 22 years. Nice. If I didn't have that, I would, just sit on my couch.
Yeah.
Now the question is at the next, let's say, conference a shark conference, maybe Sharks International, are you going to get in the ring and compete against Britt Finucci? Because she seems to be
I think she beat the hell out of me, because she's a competitive Thai boxer. Yeah. And my brother was a pro Thai boxer, so I've seen how they fight, and I was like, oh, look, if you're gonna kick my shit when eggs in, anyway, I think she'd probably beat me up. So probably not.
There you go. Well, Yanni, this has been really terrific. Just one last question for you is like, so what advice would you have for a young person starting out who wants to do marine biology, sharks? Would you have any advice for them?
I do. And I think my advice is, don't get too focused. Don't get too obsessed with like, I want to study sharks or this species of shark, even if that's the animal you want to work with. And I say that because especially, and I'm saying this more from an academic standpoint, if you want to go into academia, if you want to get, let's say, into a faculty position, they don't advertise for shark biology positions. That's not what universities are looking for. They're looking for like a predatory ecologist or a conservation biologist or whatever it may be. So a lot of my work is with sharks. I mean, those are my favorite animals. But I actually don't call myself a shark scientist. I don't like to use that term because it really just kind of pigeonholes us. So I'll call myself like a predatory ecologist or an animal ecologist or so something broader. So I try and tell students to think broad. Don't get just too focused on one animal. And really, some of the most interesting things I think I've done has been when I've collaborated with people from other fields, statisticians, particularly people from like math backgrounds or engineering backgrounds. So, really don't neglect your math or your physics. You may not like it. You may not think it's important, but I really wish that I had, a stronger background in those fields. I mean, I find good people to collaborate with, but I think especially coming up, think broad. I really love theoretical biology now. It's never something I thought I would say. But go out and read the broader literature. Don't get too tunnel vision just for sharks.
Yeah.
And can I ask, like, some of your former students or some of the students that have come through your lab, like what types of jobs did they get when they came out of the graduate programs?
Yes, I mean, several of them, go on to do postdocs. I've had some are now working for NGOs. Some are working for NOAA. So kind of a wide range. And obviously, there's many things you can do with a PhD. It doesn't have to be just academia. It's good to start thinking about what your long-term goal is, because again, especially once you get to the PhD level, you just want to start thinking ahead as to what I want to do after this.
Yeah.
And look, the fact is, especially for academia, it just continuously gets more competitive, right? I mean, it was very competitive when I was coming up, and it's way more competitive now because there's a lot more very qualified people out there for the same number of jobs. So you really got to start planning ahead of the time to try and be, to increase your chances of getting the position you want.
Absolutely.
Great.
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you, Yannis. It's been terrific. We'll definitely have to have you come back on.
No, my pleasure.
Around some more. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me. Enjoyed the chat.
Thank you, Yannis, for joining us on the Beyond Jaws podcast. Really great to have you on. Dave, to be able to dive 300 feet below the surface to see sharks, a lot of people won't even go 5 feet under the surface to see sharks. He's going 300 feet with colleagues to do this type of work. It's dangerous. You have to be very skilled and very well trained to do this type of stuff. You have to be calm, and be able to handle being in those depths. Mm-hmm. What did you think? Would you ever do that?
Yeah. Well, probably when I was in my 20s and 30s, I would say that. But they didn't have that. That really wasn't an option back then. I used to do a lot of diving. But when I was a young person, I would have probably gotten into having gone in that direction. But they didn't really have those types of technical stuff he did that was not available when I was coming through in the 80s. And of course, he came through about 20 years later when they had a lot of those techniques. And even as he explains, a lot of those stuff, they were still making it up as they went along, essentially developing it, because they really didn't have a formal protocol down, which is now they do. So there's a little bit of gosh, and by golly, we hope Yanni comes back from the dive. And
it is let's be honest, the people have passed away from that before. It's a dangerous situation. You really have to know your stuff, and you have to spend the hours it takes to understand how to use the equipment in various situations. It's not always an easy, calm dive, and sometimes things can get panicked, and you have to stay calm. And obviously Yannis has been able to do that over his career. It's impeccable to hear about.
I think he talked a little bit towards the end about his jiu-jitsu and stuff, and how that kind of helps him mentally as well as physically, because you got to be in really good shape to do that type of diving, but also mentally you've got to be, in addition to the experience, you got to be able to push the limits without panicking. There's obviously situations that come up, as he said, where you never know what's going to happen until it happens. But the better prepared you are, the better physically and mentally fit you are, your chances if something goes bad, you'll be able to deal with it better. And I think that was kind of the whole sort of mind body thing. And this technical diving is really where it takes place, where you've got to have that whole combination there to be able to go through and to do that type of extreme diving. But it'd have been, I kind of a little envious of, if I was younger at the time when they had that, it would be really cool to do, to experience that. I think the other thing too, I just wanted to touch on is, we talked, and we've done this a few other episodes, talked about some of the stuff. Yanni mentioned how, Jaws really got him hooked onto sharks early on. And he talked about how the Nat Geo show with Eugenie Clark back in the 80s was a very inspirational. I remember seeing that when I was a grad student in the mid 80s there. It was a really well done show. And then of course, once again, we talked about Blue Water White Death, but for younger people, those are, from a historical standpoint, to see kind of where things were in terms of shark research and shark knowledge going back to the 70s and 80s. It kind of gives you a different perspective, or a better perspective to today, where we are today in terms of shark research. And I think Yanni touched on it too, when he was coming through, and certainly when I was there before that, there wasn't a lot of options there. You just had very few labs. And even today, you don't really have a lot of shark labs, but people find ways to make it work. But there was all back then in the 80s, 90s, it was almost nothing. You could count on one hand the places you could go do sharks.
Yeah, no, 100%, 100%. Yeah. No, it's definitely a wonderful interview. We would like to hear what you think of it. You can contact us on the Beyond Jaws Pod Instagram. And Dave, if they want to ask you questions, how would they get a hold of you?
Yeah, you can go through my Instagram account, Lost Shark Guy, and I now have a YouTube channel up, Lost Shark Guy, and we just posted our first video documentary, Searching for Lost Sharks, and I hope people go there and check out the episodes and subscribe to it. And subscribe to the Beyond Jaws podcast YouTube channel as well. and you'll get all the shark stuff you want to get from those two sources there. So
absolutely.
Anyway,
looking forward to it. And we're going to put the social media sites for Yannis on there. So if you ever want to follow him, get to know him a little bit more, you can do so. And if you're interested in predatory science, that would be the person that you would want to go to. And so thank you so much for Dave and of course Yannis for joining us on the podcast. And of course, we would thank you for listening to the Beyond Jaws podcast from Dave and I. Really appreciate it. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.